Well, here we are again with Dr. Steve Reid of George W. Truett Seminary at Baylor University, professor of Christian scriptures, occasional preacher at St. Albans, and fine Christian man. How do you feel about the Byrds' song on their crossover country album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, I Like the Christian Life? Do you?
I do like the Christian life. I'm gonna have to look up that song. I don't think I've heard that song before.
Well, I'm pretty sure it's a cover, but it's kind of this song about somebody post-conversion experience, and all his friends wish he would still come hang out with them and have a good time, but he says, "Nah, I like the Christian life,"
I
which
like
is
the Christian
how I
life.
think about you, Steve.
Oh, thank you.
Well,
I've got a
yeah, go ahead, Neal.
question for you. As I was thinking, this is a bit personal, not really, but what is your favorite psalm? We have 150 psalms, and if you had to like your psalm at your funeral,
Yeah.
what would it be?
The psalm at my funeral.
Is that the same as your favorite? I don't know.
No, it wouldn't be the same as my favorite. When it comes to favorite, I have 4 children and 5 or more grandchildren, and you just don't have a favorite. You have a favorite at the time, but not a favorite overall. But if we're asking the funeral question, then I'd probably think it separates you from the love of God in Psalm 139. Where can I go and escape God? No place. Those two would work well in a funeral.
Very good.
But that doesn't make Psalm 139 my favorite because it has other issues.
Yes, there's that weird turn in 139, isn't it? There.
Yeah.
It's a complex book. Well, today we're going to talk about Psalm 105, and when Steve and I first got on, it's the Ballad of Israel. And the lectionary, we're going to talk about what's in the lectionary, which for this week, which is not all of Psalm 105, because if it had all of it, we'd be there forever. It's long. So just a selection. So Steve, you want to?
Wait.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Quick aside. I just pulled up the prayer book to remind myself and review what psalms are authorized by the Book of Common Prayer for use in a burial service. And unfortunately, 108 is not included, although you probably could get some pastoral latitude on that one. But interestingly, you know how we talked last week about how in the back of the prayer book, they have the entire Psalter in there for use in liturgy, but in the funeral service, when it asks people to pick their readings, Old Testament, New Testament, Gospel, it actually goes ahead and prints all the Psalms in there for you to pick so you can read them right away. That's how important they put these in sort of the worshiping life of the congregation. And the Psalms that are approved, or at least listed here, are in right one: 42, 46, 90, 121, I lift up my eyes, 130, 139, and then they include Psalm 23, but they put both the kind of normal translation and the King James because people know it so well. So if you ever need to find the King James version of the Psalm, it's stuck on page 476 of the Book of Common Prayer. They do allow 106, which is right after the Psalm we're reading today, or at least a chunk of it, a small chunk of it. So anyways, end of aside, you failed the Episcopal Psalm test, Steve, for the funeral.
Well, 130, I may have spoken in a garbled way. I thought I said 139.
Oh, you probably did. I probably heard it in a garbled way, but you spoke clearly. Maybe the Romans 8 got stuck in my head. Never mind. You passed, flying colors. You're one step closer.
Also, there's an interesting book by William Holiday, I think 1,000 Years of Psalm Study. And in that book, he argues that Psalm 23 was not a favorite psalm until the Civil War. During the Civil War, Psalm 23 became a funeral psalm. And because of that, it got great visibility and visibility that it has up to this very day. But prior to that, he says you have very few references to Psalm 23.
And does he talk about, that's fascinating, why Psalm 23 was so popular in the Civil War? Is it setting a table in the presence of my enemies, that there was this battle raging?
I think the battle raging.
Huh. I
Well,
mean,
that wasn't even on the agenda today, but that's fascinating.
It's an interesting book, and that's sort of the last chapter. Where did Psalm 23 become a sort of icon of American faith? Because for many people, Psalm 23 is the only psalm they know.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, you could do worse. It is a good one.
It is a good one.
It is a good one.
And I think Coolio quotes it.
That's right. Or is that in what song?
Gangster's Paradise.
Paradise. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I almost said Amish Paradise.
Also highly worthy of note.
Yes.
Glad you brought it up.
All right. Well, Steve, I'm gonna pull up Psalm 105, which is the selection from the lectionary up on the screen. And do you mind just reading through it, and we'll just jump right in?
I'll be glad to. Oh, okay.
How do I get this? All right.
High tech.
Yes.
Here we go.
Give thanks to the Lord and call upon his name. Make known his deeds among the people. And speak of all his marvelous works. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Search for the Lord and his strength. Continually seek his faith. Remember the marvels he has done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth. O offspring of Abraham, his servant, O children of Jacob, his chosen. He led out his people with silver and gold. In all their tribes, there was not one that stumbled. Egypt was glad of their going because they were afraid of them. He spread out a cloud for a covering and a fire to give light in the night season. They asked, and quails appeared, and he satisfied them with bread from heaven. He opened the rock, and water flowed, so the river ran in the dry places. For God remembered his holy word and Abraham his servant. So he led forth the people with gladness, his chosen with shouts of joy. He gave his people the lands of the nations, and they took the fruit of others' toil, that they might keep his statutes and observe his laws. Hallelujah. As someone said earlier, the ballad of the people of Israel. Last week, we looked at Psalm 114, and we said this is in Book 5 of the Psalter. I know last week was a long time ago, so I'm going to rehearse some things. Remember that the Book of Psalms is divided into 5 sections, 5 books, and that the 5th book is probably the latest book. Not that all those Psalms were the last Psalms written, but that was the last collection added. Today, our Psalm is from Book 4. Now, just so that you get a sense of the terrain, Book 4 begins with Psalm 89. Begins with Psalm 90. But Psalm 90 is meant to be a response to Psalm 89. And you're probably saying, okay, well, I have no idea what's in Psalm 89. Why do I care? Psalm 89 is a rather long lament over the fall of the nation. And after the fall of the nation, after the disgrace to the house of David, the Psalter in Psalm 90 starts to talk about the sovereignty of God. David may be gone, but Psalm 90 is a prayer of Moses, a man of God. So even when, in some sense, the nation is coming apart, Book 4 wants to say God continues to hold us together. If we look at canonically at the Lament of 89, as I said, Book 4 is a response. Prime in that response is Psalm 93 and 95, which celebrate the reign of God. These are sometimes called the Lord Reigns Psalm because that theme figures prominently. That section has as its famous, most famous psalm is Psalm 100. In some traditions, this was sung every Sunday. Make a joyful, be joyful in the Lord, all you lands. You probably know Psalm 100.
Well, actually, we call it the Jubilate, and it's one of two psalms that always begins morning prayer, one of the invitatory psalms. And so our people have they know it more now than they ever did before because we're doing morning prayer on Sunday morning instead of Holy Eucharist in Coronatide. When I announced the first day we do it's from and what it is, somebody said they will now start ordering that at Starbucks.
I didn't know that Starbucks did the Psalms, but
well, they have the Venti latte, the Grande latte, and the Jubilate.
I knew I was being set up.
So the Jubilate is really the heart of Book 4. And by the time we get to Psalm 105, we are really at the end of Book 4, and Book 4 ends with two historical psalms. I do want to say, for those of you who are just sort of jazzed about the Psalms, Psalm 103 and 104 accent the blessing. So you go from the Jubilate to an emphasis on blessing to a rehearsal in 105 and 106 of the history. So when we talk about the ballad of the people of Israel, we're only half joking. This is one of the historical psalms. We have 150 psalms, but we only have 5 historical psalms. Psalm 78, Psalm 105, Psalm 106, Psalm 135, and 136. So you notice that once we begin with 78, we have really 2 pairs of psalms after that, both of which are historical psalms. Now, you might be wondering, well, what is a historical psalm? A historical psalm is a psalm that rehearses God's redemptive activity for the people of Israel, and probably is located in the liturgy just for that purpose. If we're trying to think of a liturgical parallel, even though I'm a Baptist, I'm going to make this attempt. The great prayer of thanksgiving in the Eucharist provides some of that same sort of ethos. It talks about what God has done for God's people, and that's probably what's going on in the historical Psalms. It's not meant to replace History 101, but it is meant to remind people of how God has acted in history on their behalf.
The word remember here jumps out. And, in the Eucharistic prayer, it is a memorial.
Memorial.
And a remembrance.
Yes. Partly because, and at the seminary, I always remind our students, because a number of our students aren't big on why they need to know biblical history. They said, these people are dead. They've been long dead. I'm not related to any of them. I don't need to know. And
Steve, you tell me where these people live. I will find them and I will thump them with a Bible.
well, that's thumping them with the Bible is probably a good strategy, because I remind them that the point of the incarnation is that God entered into history. And if you don't like history, then you're probably not going to be much into incarnation. If you're not in the incarnation, Christianity is probably not your cup of tea.
There's other religions for you.
There are other religions.
Yeah.
But the historical Psalms reminds us of God's activity in history. Now, what they do is they do this in a much more long form. They're much more like Les Miserables, where they have long songs than they are a short commercial. Last week with our passage of 114, we had a much more emblematic view of history. And in just sort of a few words, they would talk about everything that is connected to the Exodus. Here, you're going to get a much more detailed appearance of that.
It's the story to, or these long songs, not a quick little "I want to hold your hand."
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This reminded me much more of American Pie.
Which is, has that ballad, goes through long sort of historical events and has, not to stretch this too far, but it does refer to things that have actually happened. And if you know what the singer's talking about, you can sort of get at what he's saying, which I think there is some of that going on in the Psalms, in this one in particular.
That's right. And that's one reason why we're going to rehearse some of the cross-references that the text assumes that we know, but in the 21st century, people don't always know.
Yeah.
The passage has really 5 sections. We're going to talk about 2 of them. It begins with a call to worship. You can say that the psalmist was the first Episcopalian, and that the Psalter, in fact, many scholars call the Psalter the prayer book for the Second Temple. So it begins with a call to worship in 1 through 6. Then you have a discussion of the ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is section 2, 7 through 15. Then I continue to be surprised by this. You have a section on Joseph, verses 16 through 23. This is partly interesting because Joseph is just a connector between the book of Genesis and Exodus, often not receiving a lot of attention. Then the next section describes the people's time in Egypt, verses 24 through 36. And then the final section, from the edge of the Sea of Reeds or Red Sea to the Promised Land, in verses 37 through 45. We're going to just sort of focus on 1 through 6 and then 37 through 45. Now, we're going to move through this pretty quickly. The nice thing about Zoom is if you want to watch it again, you can watch it again. And so don't worry that we're moving quickly. You can DVR this and anything important will happen more than once. 1 through 6 accents human action. And I want you to get in the habit of asking, what are the verbs in this section? And just sort of separate out the verbs. It's going to help you get a better sense of what's going on in the passage. If we follow the verbs, notice that they're not just verbs. Many of these are imperatives or commands. Now, liturgically, we call this a call to worship because that's a little bit easier than a command to worship. That sounds sort of heavy-handed. call sounds much more, warm and fuzzy. But nonetheless,
We
this is,
invite you to consider maybe, if you feel like it, worshiping.
No pressure.
Yeah.
No pressure. If you wanted to,
Yeah.
you really should.
Now for the writer of the Psalm, there's the awareness, if you decide not to do this, it is the end of your life.
But no big
So,
deal.
yeah, so the call to worship is a pretty significant thing. But let's just look at some of those verbs. I won't tarry on them very much. The first verb there is a verb which is in the Book of Common Prayer is translated give thanks. This can also be translated as confess or witness.
Interesting.
One of the reasons I want to lift this up is not that I'm against thanks, but I want you to recognize that when you give thanks publicly in worship, you are saying something about a relationship. There are politics in the process of giving thanks. When you make a testimonial of your obligation to another being, you're making a statement of relationship. John Goldingay calls the word translated I give thanks. He translates that because confession, witness, testifying are part of the process of giving thanks. And so when Israel talked about giving thanks, it wasn't just a matter of stewardship, it was a matter of mission. It was a matter of identity. The next verb is make known or disclose. This is nice. I mean, it's good for us to make known, but I want you to just sort of let that sink in. What does it mean to make known? The Hebrew here is a word for experiential knowledge. For those of us who have been parents, and for those of us who have been children, we know the process of making something known so that it lingers in the person over a course of time. Hebrew has a special verb form for this making known. Cause somebody to know. Imagine, as a parent, what does it mean that you cause them to know? I don't want to meddle, but let me ask the question. How do you cause your children to know God? And so the make known used in this section is just that. Our next imperative is sing. Sing occurs about 9 times as an imperative, but in antiquity as today, sing has a quality of forming people. When Aaron was talking about the jubilate, there's something that happens in the saying or singing of the jubilate every morning. There's something that is imprinted on you. One of the things that I've learned in years of teaching in a seminary, people often forget what a various sermon will say, but they will remember the jubilate. They will remember the songs.
Mm-hmm.
They will remember what they sing. And so when it says sing, it's also a gesture toward spiritual formation. An imperative that I was surprised by is glorify the name of God's holiness and rejoice. This is an interesting combination of verbs. Glorify is from the Hebrew word kavod, to make to make to recognize the heaviness of something. Rejoice
The
has a
weight
certain
of his
lightness.
glory.
Yeah, weight in his glory. And so you have the heaviness of kavod and glorify, and you have the lightness of rejoice. And they're working so well together so that you're rejoicing and you're glorifying at the same time. But I really want to point out that this accents the importance of joy in faith. Because we all know folks who are very faithful, but they don't seem very joyful. For the psalmist, if you're not somewhat joyful, you're probably not faithful, because glory.
It's hard to make known to people too the good deeds of the Lord, like in that sense of Hebrew making known, if there's not joy, right?
If there's not joy, that's right. That's right.
Come follow the Lord. It's terrible.
You won't.
No, it doesn't sell.
Doesn't sell. Seek is a common imperative. And here the writer does an interesting thing. The writer provides two different words for seek, one darash, and the other bakash, and puts them in parallelism so that you get a sense of seek. Yeah, I really did mean seek.
Hey, I got a question for you, Steve.
Yeah.
In verse 4, so the prayer book version we're looking at here says, search for the Lord and his strength, continually seek his face. So there you have those two different verbs.
Yeah.
In the ESV, seek the Lord and his strength, seek his presence continually. So presence versus face. What's a more accurate reading of the text?
Well, the face is the metaphor for presence.
Okay.
And what they've done is they've replaced the metaphor with the category presence. One of the things that that I talk about in listening in is the importance of face, panim. So that whether you're in a culture where you look people in the eye or a culture where you don't look people in the eye, the access to the face is a key element. Because there's a sense that when we have access to the face, we have the access to the person. And so when they talk about seek the face of God, they're talking about seek the presence of God. Then we come to, as Neal was talking about it, we come to remember. Remember only occurs 3 times in the Psalter. Interestingly enough, all of those are in the historical Psalms. It occurs 3 times as an imperative. But once again, if people don't remember the story, they don't really get the story. These imperatives apply to the offspring of Abraham and Jacob. Notice the parallelism. Abraham, the servant, and Jacob, the chosen. So they want to lift up 2 elements of the identity. One scholar says all the imperatives are plural, meaning that the entire congregation is to become those who testify about God's action. One of the challenges of the 21st century is a challenge to testify to God's action in a world that doesn't always recognize God's action. In fact, one might say that the community, this amounts to the essence of what is the human vocation. Because when we do this, testifying, remembering, we do this because of what God has already done. If we, we've looked at the verbs, let's look at how they're describing God's events, God's work. They're going to talk about a recognition of divine deeds, wonders, miracles, and judgments. The point of this human vocation is always to be surprised by the miracles of God. Brueggemann talks about this as an abiding astonishment. Sometimes, as we think about history, we can lose the real appreciation for the miraculous nature of it, the wonderful nature of it. And for the psalmist, history is a testimony to God, and we get to see some of the beauty of God, some of the wonderfulness of God in God's acts in history. Let's jump now to the end of the passage, the wilderness and the home. The imperatives here, the imperatives in the first section are refracted on the acts of God outlined in this section. Verse 37 reminds us that God is there, and God really sort of moves along the Exodus story. But also in verse 37, there's a reference that many contemporary Christians don't remember. This is the despoiling of the Egyptians in Exodus 12, verse 35 and 36. You see, not only did God formulate the Exodus for the Hebrews, but God made it possible that the Egyptians would finance the Exodus.
Really,
imagine.
Early Christian writings, the despoiling of the Egyptian gold becomes a huge metaphor for all sorts of different things in the early church that just like you said, we've lost. That you take the good out of things.
And so, yes, and so part of what you see in the Exodus story is just the sort of surplus of God's grace in the story. It would have been enough for God to get them out. But God got them out and got them paid for by the Egyptians. And the passage goes on. The Egyptians were happy when they left because they were afraid of them.
And there, you mentioned Les Mis earlier, so I'll bring it back again. When Jean Valjean steals the silver of the bishop, and the bishop, he's caught, brought back, caught red-handed, and the bishop says, "Oh, you forgot the spoons too." Like, basically, take all of it, and which to me reminds me of this Exodus story. As the Hebrews leave, the Egyptians say, "Take the gold and silver too. Just get out of here."
Just get out of here. That's right. And in some regards, your reference is very helpful because it redeems it. In the Exodus story, they're doing it to get rid of, but in Les Mis, it is an expression of generosity. Yeah. So the wilderness, one of the things that it talks about God feeds them quail and manna in the wilderness. But this you can see in Exodus 16, 13 through 15. And that's fine, but I do want to take a moment. Sometimes congregations can be cantankerous. I mean, not at St. Albans, but in other places.
We nip it in the bud.
Yeah. And so God has just delivered these people. They have crossed the Sea of Reeds. The water has stood still. They have the gold and silver from the Egyptians. They're complaining they do not like the menu. Now, what does God do? God gives them quail, meat, and God gives them manna, bread from heaven. This is pretty significant stuff. I'm starting to run low on time. Let me just talk about how this psalm plays into some liturgical elements. One of the things that happens is Psalm 105 in Book 4 is quoted in 1 Chronicles 16. 1 Chronicles 16 makes a reference to the men of Asaph and you'll know that there are Asaph psalms, and the men of Asaph are part of the temple priest. And so we're seeing a place where Chronicles makes clear that Psalm 105 is already enough part of Scripture that it can be quoted in 1 Chronicles 16. Now, Psalm 105 occurs 4 times in the Revised Common Lectionary in year A. I mean, one of the things that I was blown away by, 4 times in year A. The first time, but it never occurs in year B or C. Each of these occurrences, they cut the psalm in a different way. On the 10th Sunday after Pentecost, Psalm 105, you have the first 11 verses, partly because this is paired with the Jacob cycle and the story where Jacob marries Laban's daughters. And so, as you can imagine, they're going to use the psalm and go back to the Jacob story. On the 12th Sunday after Pentecost, Psalm 105 is connected to the Joseph story. And the first reading on that day is Genesis 37, 1 through 4, and 12 through 28. On the 15th Sunday, after Pentecost, Psalm 105 is connected with the revelation of the theophany and the revelation of the divine name in chapter 3. The theme of the revelation of the divine name and the reference to I am a God of your ancestors. And if you didn't know what that meant, then all you need to do is read Psalm 105 to know what that means. And the 18th Sunday of Pentecost year A pairs Psalm 105 with Exodus 16, 2 through 15, which recounts the wilderness murmuring stories about manna, which we've just referred to. You might imagine what would happen in year A if you, and probably this does happen, you've heard this text 5 times and people probably haven't noticed this. It keeps going back to 105. Here, the committee seems to have done something, I think, in an interesting way. Just in closing, what we have as we think about the week coming up, Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the celebration of divine action, and part of the 10 high holy days, which ends with Yom Kippur. This is a time of reflection and remembering. And so this historical psalm may be a good context for communities thinking about the new year. But also, we might want to pay attention that last week we remembered 9/11. And so a historical psalm can help us as we think through what has God done in history, what is God doing in history. And so we can see in the ways in which Psalm 105 plays out in Chronicles, but also the Revised Common Lectionary, the way it invites us to think about history and God's work in history. This is going to be an interesting psalm for us to think about. I've probably run out of my time, so I better stop.
No, it's great, Steve.
It's great stuff. I mean, I think, it's wonderful that you've pointed out that in year A, as we read through the Genesis and Exodus, the calling of the patriarchs, the making of the nation of Israel, the Exodus from Egypt, that this one psalm, which covers all of that history and then some, that the lectionary committee kind of brings us back and again and again and again to see this.
Yeah. this is going to be important partly because as modern people, we often miss, well, in the Episcopal Church, you probably aren't as bad about this as Baptists. In an individualistic context, we often miss how repetition helps form faith.
Mm-hmm.
And hearing the psalm 5 times over the course of the year, each time connecting it, helps us remember that Psalm 105 is that rehearsal. Just as the liturgy helps us remember the divine story, and that divine story leading to the cross and resurrection.
So much of what we do as Christians is an act of remembering. The whole
Yes.
liturgical year is built around remembering specific events of God's mighty deeds through Jesus Christ. And what we do in the Eucharist is more than simply a remembrance, but it is a remembrance. We remember saints. We remember key events from Jesus's life. I mean, it's I love what you said at the beginning, that this remembrance is connected with worship and with our witness in the world, that this is our mission, is to be people who remember these stories.
That's right.
Yeah,
Because,
oh, go ahead, Steve.
Because in the process of remembering, we are also saying that God continues to act. It's not as though God used to act and no longer acts. We remember because God is still acting.
Yeah, so the prayer book in Rite 2 for Holy Eucharist has 4 different versions of the Eucharistic prayers, and use at different times throughout the year, particularly in times that are centered around the Incarnation. So Advent and Christmas and Epiphany. The opening prayer after the Lord be with you and with thy spirit and that whole thing, we give thanks to you, O God, for the goodness and love which you've made known to us in creation. So here we are, Genesis 1 and 2, in the calling of Israel to be your people. So that's the patriarchal narratives. In your words spoken through the prophets. So now we've moved ahead in scripture, sort of into the pre-exilic and then the exilic period. And then above all, in the word made flesh, Jesus, your son, and you've made him incarnate in these last days. So it collapses thousands of years of history, but it is that remembering. And then of course we go on to remember that meal, which is very much a hearkening back to the first Passover. So it's a remembering of this exodus from Egypt, and then and how that connects to what Jesus has done. So yeah, all this remembering, all pulled together. And I love that we're doing this series, because so often people hear the Psalms are like, oh, this is like pretty Bible poetry, but it's remembering the mighty acts of God, what God has done. And these aren't acts that happened to people a long time ago, although they're also acts that are very much true for us. And I think for you and me, we're like the Israelites who get delivered out of Egypt and they're like, these French fries are cold, yeah, let's go back to Egypt where the food was delicious and, the beer flowed like wine. And so we tend to focus on we forget. And so this remembering again, and I think, if there was something that I would say to our congregation to take out of this, is spend some time today thinking about what are the marvelous works of what God has done in your life individually, in your life corporately. I mean, however you want to think about it, but I think we forget so quickly what God has done for us.
Absolutely.
The line that he satisfied them with bread from heaven, that the manna, this is used again in, I think, Psalm 78, where it retells this, that the manna is called the bread of heaven, which is used, Jesus calls himself the bread of heaven, the Eucharist is called the bread of heaven. Like, it's amazing, the mighty deeds of God of feeding his people in the wilderness. It's happening today. In the world, where people are breaking bread together, gathered around, even in COVID time, gathered around the Eucharist. That it's not just a past thing of God saving his people, but he's doing it now.
Yeah.
Well, as we close, is it now time for Neal to chant Psalm 105?
So Steve and I had a conversation about this before you got on. I'm gonna do it, 105 is awfully long. So coming up, Psalm 19 is coming up, and I'll check
Okay.
Psalm 19 in a couple of weeks.
It'll be like the bonus reel, like the director's cut, you know.
That's right.
Bonus content.
Yeah. But
Well, Dr. Reid, thank you. What was that, Neal?
The choir sings it, so.
Well, I'm sure your mom will be disappointed that we're not chanting Psalm 105 this week. She'll have to wait for next week or whenever we do Psalm 119.
Our moms are our biggest fans, so.
That's right.
Great.
We would have no social media presence at St. Albans if it weren't for the moms of the clergymen. They're in our corner. What can I say?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that brings us to another. And by the way, this was the psalm that gave us the title for this whole series, the fire in the night. And he talks about in verse 39, a fire to give light in the night season. And we saw that, by the way, dear listeners and watchers, as kind of a metaphor for God's presence is often in the dark in our lives, and Psalms give testimony to that. And even when it feels like a dark time, which many of us are going through now with the individual and corporate impact of a pandemic and an economic downturn and all these different things, that even in the night season, God gives us light, and most notably the light of Christ to guide us through this world. So thank you, Steve, for being a light unto the Psalms as we seek to understand it. And we look forward to joining again next week as we continue to explore the book of Psalms.
Thank you very much. Have a good week.